skies will be filled with the greatest air armada the world has ever seen. Our own Army Air Forces, the best planes ever built, 65,000 planes this year. And by the time you finish your training, America will have overwhelming superiority in the air.
Thank you very much. My name is John Lynch, and I am going to do today's presentation about that airplane and the ship that it operated off of, which were called Escort Carriers. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if 40% of this audience never actually even heard of an escort carrier, because they were one of the many unsung heroes of World War II. But by the end of our 40 minutes, I got my little timer started here. By the end of our 40 minutes, you'll at least have a passing acquaintance with escort carriers and what they did in World War II. We're going to just run about 35, 40 minutes. If you got some absolutely pressing questions, raise your hand, but if not, why don't you wait until the end of the presentation, because we got mics around. But I love, like all the docents here in the museum, I love questions. And there are no questions that we don't have the answers to or can't make them up. So anyway, this is about the escort carriers of World War II. They were known somewhat affectionately, but sarcastically, as sailors will always be, as CVEs. They were combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. And they were, unlike the large attack carriers, they were kind of cheaply built on the cheap. And they were not particularly heavily armored. They didn't have a lot of defensive capabilities, but they were never meant to go into harm's way. So consequently, they were combustible, vulnerable, and expendable when they accidentally got into harm's way. We're going to do kind of an introduction to what the CVEs were and what they weren't. We're going to talk about two stories. Usually when you come to these Saturday presentations, you only get one story, but I'm kind of a bargain basement sort of guy, so I'm going to give you two stories today, and then we're going to talk about a postscript that has some relevance to the museum and is fairly interesting. What kind of jobs do we ask aircraft carriers to do? Why do we build aircraft carriers? Well, we build aircraft carriers for a bunch of reasons. The primary one is to engage in major naval battles. Remember, World War II was the transition from battleship navy to aircraft carriers. So the engagements are not naval rifles, guns shooting 15, 20 miles away, but airplanes flying as much as 100 miles away to engage the enemy. So those big major naval battles required big, fast, tough aircraft carriers that would carry a lot of planes. But consequently, they were very expensive, and they took a long time to build. We had a lot of other jobs that we asked aircraft carriers to do, and among them were pilot training. If you're going to fly in an aircraft carrier, you got to do your qualifications sometime, so that's one job. We ask aircraft carriers and the aircraft on them to protect convoys, to chase submarines, to support amphibious landings. The airplanes support amphibious landings, transporting or ferrying airplanes from the United States of America to the far reaches of the Pacific and the European theater, and mine laying, and a lot of other tasks. So unlike the major combatants that needed to be big, fast, tough, and carry a lot of planes and cost a lot of money, most of these other tasks don't require, so not so much. So we could end up having cheaper, smaller, and much more available aircraft carriers to do those jobs. The United States Navy and the Royal Navy, in its wisdom, wanted to get the big, fast, tough, expensive tools, and they were not particularly interested in the smaller aircraft carriers. So there was a bit of politicking that went on in the early parts of World War II that resulted in the escort carriers. This is a kind of an interesting graphic. These are the ships we're going to be talking about today. These are Bogue-class CVEs, so carrier. And remember, CV is the designation for a carrier. So V is the Navy's designation for fixed-wing aviation. So these are escort carriers. There was a group of carriers called light carriers, and they were built on some cruiser hulls that were excessed because of the London Naval Treaty. And there were about 9 of them, and they are not the escort carriers we're talking about. And then there were the whole class of Essex-class aircraft carriers, and you can see they were much larger. Finally, we had the Midway class that was built at the very end of World War II, and of course our current Nimitz-class aircraft carriers. So it gives you some idea of the difference in size between and among the various aircraft carriers. In World War II, we had about 25 attack carriers, but we had almost 60 escort carriers here in the United States Navy. I'm fighting the end of a head cold, so I'm going to get these coughing fits every once in a while, and I know it sounds disgusting, but I'll try to cut the mic and I'll mute it myself, but I apologize in advance. So we can see that the escort carriers that we're talking today are about 1/3 the size of the large Essex-class aircraft carriers. They were about 1/3 slower, so they couldn't do the 33 knots that the fleet needed, the battle fleet needed to get from A to B, so they were slow. They carried about 1/4 of the number of airplanes that the attack carriers carried, and they took a much shorter time to build. These were like the Liberty ships that were built in the Kaiser yards in the West Coast. So they would crank these things out in about 4 months, and they were a mere fraction of the cost of what the large attack carriers were. So there were a lot of them. We built 6 different classes of escort carriers. The first couple have very few. The ones that we're going to talk about mostly today are the Bogue class, of which we built 11 for the United States Navy and about 34 for the Royal Navy, the British Royal Navy. The Casablanca class, which had about 50 built, and finally the Commencement Bay class. We're going to talk primarily about the Bogue and a little bit about the Commencement Bay when we talk about our 2 stories. Give you an idea of the size of what an escort carrier looks like. This is an aerial view of the pavilion. We're over here somewhere. I've got to get my other pointer. We're over here somewhere. So this is the old museum, hangars 1, 2, 3, and this is the pavilion. And this red outline is the flight deck of a Bogue-class aircraft carrier. So that airplane and 23 of its wonderful friends would operate on that little footprint. So when Ian comes out and flies this plane later on and lands on our 13,000-foot runway here in Colorado Springs, he can look by at this footprint and say, I'm glad I don't have to do that today. So that's what the Essex class, the escort carriers are. They're small, they're not particularly fast, they're cheap, we have a lot of them, and they're kind of vulnerable. They're not particularly well armored, they don't have a lot of guns and cannons on them. They're not meant to do that. They're meant to do all of those other jobs that we ask aircraft carriers to do in World War II. But sometimes things don't go particularly well. So we're going to tell you 2 stories, and one is about the hunter-killer groups and the operations of escort carriers in the mid and North Atlantic. Give you a little bit of background. Remember, we here in the United States of America, as the arsenal of democracy, are making airplanes, tanks, munitions. We're shipping food and fuel to our allies in Great Britain and to the Soviet Union. And our adversaries, the Third Reich, are operating submarines in the North Atlantic and the Mid-Atlantic and sinking the ships, the merchantmen that have those goods on board them, and that's called the Battle of the Atlantic. And we did a presentation here 2 years ago in April 2023 about the Battle of the Atlantic. And this aviation, airplanes from Iceland, Scotland, England, Canada, and the US provide air cover over a certain amount of those convoys as they transit the North Atlantic. But because of limited range of those airplanes, there are gaps in the Atlantic, and that's where the U-boats, the Kriegsmarines, the German Navy, the Kriegsmarines U-boats sit in wolf packs and try to sink our submarines. And our friends in the escort carriers provide a huge amount of protection for those convoys as they transit those air gaps, those gaps in the coverage from land airplanes. So when they start, the United States Navy starts getting involved in the war before Pearl Harbor, because they're U.S. ships and they're being sunk by the Kriegsmarine. So we provide some protection, but constantly try not to get involved in active warfare because we haven't declared war yet. So generally, the anti-submarine warfare activities of the Essex-class carriers are pretty much defensive. So we have a tendency to stick with the convoys and only keep the U-boats from sinking the convoys. We don't actively chase them and pursue them. But by the time we get into about 1943, first quarter of 43, and into the summer of 43, we start getting many more assets. So we start, our shipyards are cranking out escort carriers, and our airplane factories are cranking out airplanes, so that we can change from a defensive posture, simply protecting the convoys, to an offensive hunter-killer groups. So we're going to go after them and sink them before they threaten the convoys. We're able to do that because we have more assets, but the landscape has changed because we start getting better signals intelligence. Signals intelligence we always think as decoding. So we think of the Ultra and the Enigma machines that the Germans are using to encode their messages, and the Ultra codes. But there is also a thing called high-frequency detection direction finders, where we can use land-based and eventually ship-based radio detection to find out where the radio signals are coming from and therefore know where the submarines are. That, combined with the decoding of the messages, give us a big leg up of understanding how these signals are, how the ships are operating. We have better detection technology. As you can see, when you go back to out on the ramp, you can see our Helldiver. If you look in the back cockpit and you look at the wings, you can see little Yagi antennas and a little oscilloscope, and that is the first generation of airborne radar. And this airplane and the Helldiver and the Dauntless are very effective operating off of escort carriers and finding submarines that we have located in a general sense with direction finding and decoding. One of the reasons that the decoding, the Ultra and the Enigma machines and the Ultra story is so important is that the way Admiral Dönitz, who runs the whole U-boat community for the Kriegsmarine, the way he operates his wolf packs requires a lot of talking. So he needs to direct the submarines where to go. They need to tell them when they arrive there. There's a lot of chattiness, and Dönitz likes to chat. So he creates a lot of radio traffic that we can direction find where it's coming from and going to, and then what it contains. So that has changed the dynamic of the operation of the U-boats and the dynamic of the operation of the hunter-killer groups. We have better Atlantic gap coverage with longer range airplanes, and we have better tactics and coordination between our ships and the convoys. All of those change the landscape of using the aircraft carriers and these airplanes in a defensive posture and turning them into offensive hunter-killer groups. This is a long story. The other story I'm going to tell you is going to be a very short, intense story. But this is a long story because from the mid of 1942 until the end of the war, there is constant back and forth between the United States and the Royal Navy and the Kriegsmarine wolf packs and U-boats. And this back and forth depends on technology and the use of technology by the partners in the war. We have developed radar. We talk about it on the airplanes. We have developed our fighter-bomber tactics. So when you see a lot of the pictures of the hunter-killer groups, you'll see that there are these airplanes, TBMs, torpedo bombers, so the big carrier-based bombers to carry torpedoes and depth charges and all the other kinds of weapons. But they need some protection, and that's why we also have Wildcats on board. So when you take a look at a picture, you'll see a Wildcat. So we understand that we developed the fighter-bomber tactics. We developed a very interesting little tool that was a small, it was called a mine. It wasn't a mine, it was an acoustic homing torpedo that could be dropped and were very effective in sinking submarines. So we got a lot more sophisticated technology. We get much more effective bombs and depth charges. We use Hedgehog depth charges off of some of our surface ships. Enigma and Ultra become very effective in decoding the traffic coming off of the U-boats. We organize our convoys much more effectively. And we simply build, if they're going to sink our ships, we'll build more of them. So it was called the tonnage war. So we were simply, the arsenal of democracy here in the U.S. was simply saturating the U-boat's ability to sink all of our ships by just making more ships. The Kriegsmarine, on the other hand, were not waiting there, getting beat up. They had developed some technology to detect the radar that we were using. They had a lot of coordination of the wolf packs. That had some positive aspects. The wolf packs became very effective, but it also had negative aspects because it let us find them. They developed large supply submarines. So some of the smaller U-boats could stay out at sea longer because the milk cows could refuel them at sea and resupply them at sea. They had developed much more offensive tactics. And this airplane, when it would go down to attack a submarine by dropping depth charges, would be shot at by anti-aircraft guns on the decks of the U-boats. So the U-boats weren't just sitting there waiting for people to drop bombs on them. They were becoming much more aggressive also. Dönitz was actually fairly successful in convincing Hitler to invest in building more submarines. And he flooded the North Atlantic with a lot of submarines. And the Kriegsmarine had a very high tolerance for loss of crews. Being a U-boat submarine sailor was probably one of the most dangerous things after being a B-25 bomber crew. It was a very, very dangerous thing. So in the North Atlantic, we see this kind of back and forth over a long period of time of escort carriers operating in hunter-killer groups with this airplane and with Wildcats. That's why this airplane and its mate back over in the pavilion they really grab me in the heart, because when we think of the Corsairs and the fighters and the very sexy airplanes, this airplane doesn't operate at that level. This is another kind of airplane, but it does a fantastic job, and one of those jobs is the Battle of the Atlantic. This is a picture that is on the wall. I call it a mural. The mural of the pavilion right by the other TBM that's in the corner of the pavilion, and it is the USS Core, okay? And I'm going to ask you folks to kind of remember that name, because we're going to come back to this. This is the USS Core, CVE, an escort carrier 13. It's one of the early ones. And this is April of 1944, and they are in the North Atlantic, and they're going to go on out and hunt U-boats. And when I do a tour, I always refer our guest and said, look at the shadows of those people on the deck. This is either very early in the morning or very late in the afternoon. And this is very late in the afternoon, so these airplanes are going to go off of that little short deck that I showed you at nighttime looking for submarines. And they're going to be on the surface recharging their batteries, and this is the essence of the hunter-killer group. It generally used TBMs. Usually these are later model Avengers that were built by General Motors as opposed to Grumman. And FMs, again, Wildcats built by General Motors as opposed to Grumman. And these are standard issue U.S. sailors. That's what we ask them to do, sit out on moving decks. This is a nice day, but it's cold and it's very, very windy. So this picture encapsulates this whole story that we're talking about on hunter-killer groups. And it sounds like a dull and boring and tedious job, and it is, except for those moments of terror when you find a submarine on the surface, you come in and try to lay depth charges on them, and they're shooting back at you with 40-millimeter anti-aircraft cannons. Just a picture of this airplane. When I say this airplane, I mean make and model, not this actual serial number. I like this picture because it shows the Avenger taxiing in to being launched, but it also shows a Wildcat coming up in back of it. I don't like this picture because it really doesn't show the plane being put on the catapult. These aircraft carriers had hydraulic catapults, and usually the Wildcats were light enough that if there was a good headwind, and escort carriers don't go very fast through the water, but they could usually take off without being catapulted. The Avengers, with their heavy bomb load of depth charges and torpedoes, etc., usually needed to be catapulted. And this is a picture of an Avenger, and this is one of the bridles going back down to the hydraulic catapults. Here's a picture of the Wildcat being ready to launch, etc. These are mostly, this is the Bogue, and this was the first CV9, so it was the first of the Bogue class, and it was very, very famous in the North Atlantic in the battle of, in the hunter-killer groups. But although it was the hero in doing all this very aggressive work in the North Atlantic as hunter-killer groups, we also ask it to do the mundane jobs that we ask everybody to do in the Essex in the carrier group, and that is simply transport airplanes. So they transport a lot of airplanes to North Africa in support of that operation, as well as to Europe. This is the record of the escort carriers by ship through the hunter-killer groups in the 1943, 1944 sort of time frame, a total of 54 U-boats sunk. So it sounds, well, that's a lot of effort and a lot of people and a lot of airplanes for 54 submarines. But the point is, for every submarine that they sank, they scared off and deterred probably another 5 to 10 submarines from operating in their area. So the substance of anti-submarine warfare, you obviously like to paint on the little picture of the U-boat on the side of the escort carrier, but the point is, when you're out there, you're deterring them from operating in your area and clearing up transit for merchantmen to go and help our allies. At the end of this, we're going to talk a little bit about the recognition of the BOG and the BOG operating groups, but this is the result of what they did. And it resulted in a lot of dangerous work, operating at night, off small carriers with big airplanes. The second story that we're going to tell you is the Battle of the Philippine Sea. And it's, you'll hear that talked about TAFI 3. TAFI stands for the Task Force 3, and it was one of 4 U.S. Navy task force that operated in the invasion of the Philippines after the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The issue was, after we had defeated the bulk of the Japanese carrier forces off of Guam and the Marianas, we decided, what is next? So Douglas MacArthur wanted to make sure that we invaded the Philippines because he said, I shall return. So he did want to return. Nimitz, on the other hand, argued that maybe we could just leave the Philippines behind and invade what was called Formosa at that time, we now know as Taiwan, and then proceed up the chain for the invasion of the mainland. And it was a fairly spirited debate, and finally had to be settled by the President, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And here he sits being briefed by Admiral Nimitz with Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Leahy, and in July of 1944, making the decision, what are we going to do next? And Silver-tongued Doug convinced him that we needed to invade the Philippines, and he needed to wade ashore so he could fulfill his promise to the Philippines that he would return. Let's do some geography. The big piece of the Pacific, the home islands of Japan, Wake Island, the Marianas, Guam, where I served, and this is the Philippines. It is just a conglomeration of a lot of islands. And so Doug argues that we need to take the Philippines and then proceed up through Taiwan, Formosa, into the home islands. Nimitz argues that we should bypass it, etc. So again, the President made the decision, we're going to invade the Philippines. Couple of really big islands, Mindanao, Luzon, but we're not going to do that. We're going to invade Leyte. So these are called the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Big amphibious operation on the east shore of the island of Leyte. There is a lot of Japanese military there, and it will make a good base of operations to capture the rest of the Philippines. So that's what the decision is made. So that's what we're going to do. The U.S. fleet is busted up into a couple of groups, actually 3 groups. One of them is the amphibious group, a southern group that provides some defense against the Imperial Japanese Navy is in red. The U.S. Navy's Halsey group is in green, and some of the locations are designated in these black arrows. So the southern force of the Imperial Japanese Navy is going to come through and then threaten the amphibious landing here. The central force is going to go through the San Bernardino Straits here and threaten this. And the Imperial Japanese Navy northern force is a ploy. It is a trap to get Halsey to chase them north and not to protect the amphibious landing force. and it is particularly successful. Ashby Taylor is going to do a whole presentation on the battle on the Philippines and the invasion, and it's going to be in December, I believe, and I'm not going to try to steal any of his thunder or of any of his content, except to give you the setting which in these escort carriers operate in the Leyte Gulf. So the amphibious beaches are here. The Taffy 3, Task Force 3, which consists primarily of escort carriers, not the big, brutal, tough attack carriers, but our little kind of feeble, somewhat vulnerable escort carriers, and a small group of destroyers and destroyer escorts are here protecting the eastern flank of the amphibious force. The central force is coming through the San Bernardino Straits, is attacked by some submarines, and kind of looks as though they may be going home. Halsey decides to pursue the northern force and leaves the amphibious force and the escort carriers alone to deal with the central force. And that sets the whole story for Taffy 3. Taffy 3 consists of 6 escort carriers and their assigned airplanes, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. This is the USS Guadalcanal, one of the escort carriers, relatively small, contains both TBMs, as well as Wildcats. That's the Johnson, pretty small ship. These are maybe 5-inch guns. Our adversaries in the Japanese force have 18-inch guns, and a lot of them. These are the destroyer escorts. Again, one 5-inch gun, a whole bunch of little anti-aircraft guns, but pretty puny sort of armaments. Our escort carriers have one gun, a bunch of anti-aircraft guns, but one gun, and it's a small 5-inch and is on the stern for some reason or other. Yamamoto, on the other hand, has 3 mounts of triple 18-inchers and can shoot 3,200-pound shells about 26 miles. This is not an even match. So as, let me go, I can do it from here. So as the Japanese forces come down to threaten the amphibious landing, the escort carriers have a choice. Run, which is the smart thing to do, but there's nobody else to contest with these people. We're going to shoot up the amphibious landings. So they turn and they attack. Both the airplanes off of the escort carriers, as well as the destroyers and the little destroyer escorts, go after the big battleships and cruisers in probably the most uneven match of a sea battle anywhere in history. They do it with a certain amount of courage. A young junior officer who was responsible for the operation of some of these are anti-aircraft guns, these 40 millimeters. He says, just wait a little longer, boys. We're suckering them into 40 millimeter range. 40 millimeter range is about 4 miles. And if the Japanese get anywhere near that close, you're going to be toast. So, but they do it. They turn into the Japanese force and attack with airplanes, with the few puny guns that they have on board, and convince the Japanese admiral that he has stumbled upon big, full-scale aircraft carriers. So instead of 6 little escort carriers, he somehow thinks he's going to be up against Halsey's main force with all his aircraft carriers, and he turns around and leaves. Leaving the amphibious forces alone, they're able to continue on with their invasion of the Philippines, and thus the war progresses. Both of these stories, the long story in the Atlantic, the 2.5-year-long story of the escort carriers and the courageous work they did against submarines in the North Atlantic, and the Taffy Group and the heroic efforts that they expended against the Imperial Japanese Navy halfway around the world. Instead of a 2.5-year battle, a 2.5-hour battle. Two very, very different stories, but both of them get Presidential Unit Commendations for their bravery, but as a unit. And it tells a wonderful story about escort carriers, the people, the crews, the planes, and the air crews that operated on those escort carriers. The postscript of this is that in spite of that remember, the escort carriers are doing heroic work. They get the Presidential Unit Commendation citation, but at the same time, they're doing the tough, stinking, slow, boring work of transporting airplanes and supporting amphibious operations, etc. So they do wonderful, courageous work, but there are no museums to them. There's very little known about them. I don't believe there's a movie about the escort carriers, and it is a community of sailors who seem to revel in being the underdogs. There was little recognition in movies or books. A lot of the ships stayed in service after World War II at air transport auxiliaries, amphibious assault ships, etc., and a lot of them were converted to United States naval ships, USNS ships versus United States ships. Gene says that the USS ships are basically combatants and the US naval ships are generally service ships in some form or other. I showed you a picture a little bit ago of the USS Core, remember? And that was in April of 1944. These are a lot of the escort carriers in one of the reserve fleets in San Diego. Here is, what ship is this? That's the Core. Here it is. She's been changed from a United States ship to a USNS ship, and she's with a load of Sky Raiders, which we have in our museum, attack planes in South Vietnam, the port of Saigon, in 1964, unloading Sky Raiders to be used in Vietnam. So not only do these escort carriers do heroic work and get presidential unit citations, put themselves in harm's way, they stick around, and 20 years later, they're still doing the job. And I just think that's a great story. Bill Clares thinks that we ought to work very, very hard to prove that this airplane here, being unloaded in Saigon, is our Sky Raider that's sitting in our museum. I'm going to come out and I'm going to do some work, and I am going to prove that that airplane is from our museum, whether it is or not. So the escort carriers is a great story. It's a great story because it's about people, it's about ships doing the slogging, dirty, tiresome, boring work, but every once in a while stepping in and doing what sailors need to do, and that is defend their country and put their ship and their lives in harm's way, and in this case being recognized. In fact, although the sailors like to say they were combustible, vulnerable, and expendable, in fact, they were courageous, they were valiant, and they were enduring. So when you see our airplanes, remember that that's the sort of ship that they operated on. We see them in the context of the big Essex-class aircraft carriers, the big, twice the size, 1,000-foot-long, 35,000-ton attack carriers, but they spent most of their lives on the much smaller escort carriers all across the world doing good, solid work day after day. Thank you very much.